Welcome to the strange and mysterious world of terror at Collinwood. 'Tis I, Penny Dreadful, reluctantly handing the microphone over to my despicable doppelganger. Thanks, Penny. Hey, welcome everyone to Terror at Collinwood. Boy, this is a banger episode. You do not want to miss this episode. Trust me, it is a must-listen episode. I'm joined by Mary O'Leary, and we're going to be talking about why Dark Shadows ended. This is a subject that's been discussed for decades, and there's a lot to unpack here, and we're covering a key issue that's kind of come to light lately thanks to Mary's documentary, Dark Shadows and Beyond, the Jonathan Frid story. But, she showed some images there, but it flew past a lot of people's radars, so we're going to really dive in there and talk about some things that maybe have not been talked about yet. Mary was also kind enough to provide me with some very rare documents, evidence to kind of support what's being said here, because there have been some fans that have kind of denied some of this, and clearly there are internal documents and articles that support what Mary is saying here. This happened, and she was kind enough to provide those, and I'm going to be showing them in the YouTube version of this episode as we talk, along with some clippings from articles, some clips from previous episodes that also add evidence to what's being discussed here in this show. So there are many reasons why Dark Shadows ended, but there's a key reason that we're going to really dive into in this episode. Really deep dive, must listen episode if you're a Dark Shadows fan. We even touch on something that hasn't been discussed at all as far as I know, which is another show that could have been canceled instead of Dark Shadows. There was actually another show that ABC wanted to cancel instead of Dark Shadows, and we touch on the whole Bramwell thing. There's so much to unpack in this episode, and it's going to clear up a lot of misconceptions. After all these decades, new information has come to light in recent years thanks to Mary's diligent research, so we're going to talk about all of that. Now, before we get to the show, I want to thank everyone who's purchased a t-shirt or mug or tote bag or what have you from the new Penny Dreadful the 13th TeePublic store. And I also want to thank those who have been sending in pictures of themselves wearing t-shirts that they got at the TeePublic shop. If you want to see the pictures, jump on over to the YouTube version. I'm going to have the name of each person underneath, and please continue to do that. If you get a t-shirt over at the new TeePublic store, which features many designs, including those by the wonderfully talented Eric Marshall, who designed various versions of the Terror at Collinwood logo, which you can get on a t-shirt, you can get on a magnet, a sticker, a mug, etc. Even you can get a poster or tapestry to put on your wall, whatever you want. Eric did an amazing job. And also other wonderful artists like Donald David, who did the Guru design from Shilling Shockers, my beloved late husband, my snarling darling, Guru the werewolf in t-shirt form. Between us here, this is a podcast exclusive scoop. Donald is also doing a Penny Dreadful to go along with the Guru, and it looks fantastic. He sent me an early version of it. It looks really cool. So I'm going to be posting that certainly in time for Halloween, probably in the next couple weeks. And of course, there are designs by Liz LaFrance, Matthew McKnight, Sarah Adam, Robbie Brown, and you can get all of their great designs over at teepublic.com/user/Penny Dreadful Roman numeral 13 XIII. I will put a link in the show notes, and thank you to everyone who sent in pictures of themselves wearing t-shirts. You can also send yours in to terror@collinwood@gmail.com. And with that said, let's get to it. I am honored to be joined once again by award-winning producer and director Mary O'Leary, who is the recipient of 7 Daytime Emmy Awards for shows such as The Young and the Restless, Days of Our Lives, and General Hospital. For many years, she was the co-producer of Jonathan Frid's production company, Clunes Associates, through which Jonathan toured his remarkable one-man shows. Mary also directed and produced the award-winning documentary Dark Shadows and Beyond, the Jonathan Frid story. She was recently presented with a special recognition Saturn Award at the Dark Shadows Remembrance Weekend. Welcome back to the show, Mary.
Thank you, Danielle. Nice to be back.
It's so nice to see you again. How are you doing? How was your birthday?
Oh, I had a very nice birthday. Thank you. I've extended it for a full week. So it started earlier in the week, and I was having a dinner party with friends, and then I'm having lunch with somebody tomorrow and on the weekend. So I think it's good to celebrate birthdays at least over a week or two.
Indeed, agreed. So before we're going to be talking about a topic that's been debated for decades now, and because of your amazing documentary, you've shed some light into the dark shadows on some topics related to this issue. But before we get to that, I want to talk about the upcoming Jonathan Frid centenary that's happening on the East Coast in October. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
The Sleepy Hollow International Film Festival has decided to do a tribute to Jonathan during their event. It is a competition for films that are in the genre of supernatural, otherworldly. And they very much, Taylor White, who's the director, very much has a history with Dark Shadows. At the Music Hall in 2019, they actually showed House of Dark Shadows. Catherine Woodley Scott was there, and she talked about behind the scenes different stories about scenes that were cut and things that she had recalled that she shared with the audience. And I was there at that time. That was, again, October 2019. And I had begun work on the documentary. I'd done some interviews, and I announced that and said, look forward to it in a couple of years. So Taylor had contacted me and said, oh, Jonathan Frid Centenary, we'd love to celebrate in a small way. So I had reached out to the East Coast actresses because, as you know, Danielle, having been with us at the Remembrance in Los Angeles, the actors were the West Coast actors, although Catherine Leigh Scott is bi-coastal. So I reached out to Marie Wallace, Donna Wandry, Sharon Smith, and said, would you like to come and do a tribute to Jonathan, sponsored by the Sleepy Hollow International Film Festival? And they said yes. So it is on October 12th from 1:30 to 3. And then after that will be autograph session. During the slot, the 90-minute slot, we'll have Q&A with the three actresses. I'll also be there to answer questions. And David Selby did a wonderful performance at the event in Burbank. I put together some of Jonathan's letters when he wrote to his mother about Dark Shadows. And David performed the show, and we recorded it, and David has agreed to let it be shown at the event in Tarrytown, New York. So I'm really hoping that fans who didn't get to see it will come and watch it and enjoy chatting with us.
It's going to be a fantastic event, and I'm going to put a link in the show notes to the tickets, which are currently available. And you want to jump on this before they sell out for sure. You want to get a chance, and there's a VIP ticket as well, right?
Yes, and the basic price, basic general ticket is $25. It is a specific reserve seat, and then it's $45 for the VIP, which will include a poster that's specifically being designed for the event, as well as a gift bag with some items.
Great. Wonderful. Now, another thing I wanted to touch on that was you talked about at the Remembrance Weekend was the Jonathan Frid archive. Can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Yes, that is what I've been focusing on since the Remembrance. I'm delighted that the Ohio State University in Columbus, which has an amazing theater institute for research for not only the college itself, but people all across the states and the world have come to do research there. So Jonathan Frid's archives will be in the Lawrence and Lee Theater Research Institute on the campus. And they are delighted to have Jonathan's archives. And I have been putting together all the information that I have, that research that has been done during the documentary or personal things that I've had over the years. And I've actually reached out to fans to contribute to the archives, both by individually reaching out to some fans that I've known over the years, also posting on my social media that we're looking, or to contact me because I'm looking for specific things. The wonderful thing about the archive is not only is it all the papers that will be there to be looked at, but they do a rotating exhibit. And so they're going to be able to display Dark Shadows merchandise, such as the game, the record. So I've had people donate those as well. And those that donate, well, their name will be at the archive, so people will see who has donated. And eventually hope to do a special program there to help promote his archives. Right now, I'm a little behind schedule in terms of getting everything together, just because, as we know, life gets in the way when you have a project. There's other things that pull you in many directions. But thank you. I'm very excited that his legacy will continue, and anyone will have the opportunity to learn about him who doesn't know about. Students interested in acting will be very interested in some of the comments he made in letters to his family about how he analyzed characters and shows and his approach to acting.
There was a nice video as well that they put together about the Jonathan Frid archive. Is that online, the video that
Yes, it was with the curator, Beth Kettleman, and I do have it on our YouTube, Jonathan Frid
Great.
Doc YouTube channel. It's there.
Okay, fantastic. I'll put a link to that as well in the show notes for sure. Moving into our topic today, for decades, people have discussed the cancellation of Dark Shadows. Why did Dark Shadows end? And I like what Wallace McBride at the Collinsport Historical Society a while back posted an article. I think it was, I forgot what the title was Who Killed Dark Shadows or something to that effect. And he compared it to Murder on the Orient Express, the ending of Murder on the Orient Express. And he points to an article that was an interview with James Duffy, then president of ABC Television, who took credit for the cancellation of Dark Shadows. He said, "I hated to do it. I canceled Dark Shadows and my daughter won't speak to me." And then it says, "I canceled Lawrence Welk and now my mother won't speak to me." He also said his wife gave him the silent treatment for taking Tom Jones off the air. And we're going to get to James Duffy. He may have been the ABC executive that Dan Curtis talked to toward the end of the series. So there's that. We know that the ratings weren't what they were, certainly during the height of the series in 1897. They also weren't terrible. This is why the ratings thing I never really bought into the ratings thing. I know that a lot of the affiliates had taken Dark Shadows off the air. The ratings did drop, but they weren't, as we know, the Leviathan storyline, the ratings took a hit during the Leviathan storyline, and they never really fully recovered. There were some ups and downs, but in the Dark Shadows Almanac, there's a section here on the ratings for Dark Shadows national viewership. In the last 1970 to 1971, there were 12 million weekly viewers. Now, in June of 1967, which is 2 months after Barnabas was on the show, there were 10 million weekly viewers. That's 2 million more than there were in June of 1967. And at their lowest, the ratings were 9 million. That was July 1966. At their highest, there were 18 million viewers between 1968 and 1969. That was, of course, as we went into the 1897 storyline. So Dark Shadows was still a popular attraction. It wasn't what it was in terms of the ratings, but there was still a popular attraction to some degree. Mysterious Benefactor over on the Dark Shadows forums said that the ratings were nowhere near the type of level that would have gotten any show canceled due to low ratings. They were still quite respectable. So the ratings thing, I know the cigarette ads, they lost the advertising from the cigarette ads. So there were some financial issues. Dark Shadows, people, joke about, sometimes, shoestring budget. Dark Shadows was actually a very expensive show to produce by daytime TV standards because of the special effects, especially with ghosts and bats and all kinds of things that they would do on the show. So it was not a cheap show to produce. So there are all these factors. Any thoughts so far on anything I've said here?
In terms of the ratings, the ironic part is the ratings started to go back up during the Bramwell Catherine Morgan story, a traditional love story triangle.
Yeah. It's like a Gothic romance, Wuthering Heights, with the lottery merged into it as well. Yeah.
So Yeah, so you still got Gothic horror, Gothic romance, and also a bit of traditional soap in terms of a pregnancy
Yes,
that's
yeah.
unexpected and always did not the husband. So that's what's really fascinating to look back. And every show does have dips. I mean, I've certainly worked on 5 soap operas in their time. Their numbers are up and then they dip down and then they come back up again. The story is what drives the shows and brings people to watch. I think that, as you've just said, the ratings were not the prime cause. That was just something that could be a handle. Oh, that's the ratings were down. Oh, yes, they were down, but not terribly, as you just noted, and they were going up. But they were down at the time the decision was made to cancel the show, which most people assume the last episode, April 2nd. So I think they think, oh, the decision was made in early March. Jonathan was told back on January 14th in 1971. The cast was told, I mean, partially because they need to start looking for another job. So it wasn't as if it was last minute. There were other reasons, I think, that culminated in it. But again, there's over the years, people come up with, they hear something and then they make assumptions and it gets distorted, which is why I guess today we're trying to clarify what it is, because again, with social media, lots of people theorizing.
Yes, absolutely. I've seen a lot of that lately, and a lot of arguing over or denial over certain things. And I just want to put it out there, as we know, and I appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to come and talk about this topic, because I really want to set the record straight on this. And like I said, no, there is no one reason why Dark Shadows was canceled, but there is a really big reason why things were kind of difficult during this time that I think played a huge factor in it. And you in the documentary, you pointed some of that out. And I really want to set the record straight here as much as possible. And I want to just put this out there. Everybody listening to this, I'm sure, knows that you were Jonathan Frid's business partner for a long time. You're also his friend for a long time, and you worked with him for many years. You were close with Jonathan Frid, and we're not here. Absolutely, I am a huge fan of Jonathan Frid and of Dan Curtis too. I admire both of them, and we're definitely not here to point fingers at anybody or say that this person's fault. It's more just this situation that developed in around December, I believe. Well, there was lead up to that, but that kind of, I think things kind of fell apart from there. Let's start with, I guess, the first nail in the coffin, so to speak. House of Dark Shadows.
Yes.
Let's talk about House of Dark Shadows. Jonathan Frid was not very happy with House of Dark Shadows.
I think we should go even back
Okay.
at the beginning. So Dan Curtis was a man who was very interested in, once he directed Dark Shadows, he became very interested in directing movies. And he came up with the idea of doing the movie House of Dark Shadows 2 years before it actually was produced. And he was trying to market it, get somebody to give him a budget to do the movie. And when he finally did, he threw himself into it with great excitement. This is going to be his first film. And he knew one of the ways in which he got his backers was that, having worked on a soap, and you have to work very fast with doing an episode a day, he knew speed, how to work under pressure and the speed. And so he said, I will do a feature-length movie in 5 weeks for $750,000. And that was really a low budget and just kind of shocking to well, if you can do it for that, sure, we'll give you a contract, we'll give you a budget, go ahead. And they offered him a 3-picture deal, the first one being House of Dark Shadows. So he was, and sometimes Jonathan, he's a kid in a candy shop. He was so excited about this, and he barreled ahead and teased, as most people know, the end of the movie. The Barnabas you think is dead, But you see the bat fly away. Aha, there will be a sequel. And that was always in the back of his mind to do a sequel. Jonathan is really was respectful of writers and producers. He knew his job was to act. He was given the script. He acted. He didn't say, I need to screen, I need scenes rewritten. He did it as it played. Ultimately, when he watched the movie, he found it to be too much violence, blood, gore. Jonathan often said in interviews that to him, evil violence is what people do to each other, sadly, each day. Husband betraying his wife through an affair, your quote best friend telling a lie about you. Those are the real evils of life. He didn't care for horror movies. They didn't frighten him. He just thought it was very ho-hum. So he didn't like the film. He was concerned because he wanted to continue. I mean, during Dark Shadows, as you know, he did theater. He went away and did the Dial M for Murder. So he still wanted to do other things. And he was concerned because when the reviews came out, and the movie did not get good reviews. I've looked back, and it's because I did a lot of research, obviously, for the documentary, and I have clippings. And they're basically some of the headlines: an unappetizing horror film. TV horror show makes slow film. Film okay for fans who thrive on blood. I mean, did not do well in terms of the critics. However, it made money, which of course pleased the producers who backed it. And we're very excited to do another one, make more money for us. The press also mentions Jonathan as the monster. And his concern was, boy, I'm going to get typecast as a monster. He always said, character of Barnabas on the TV show was very, very varied. He played a number of emotions.
Yeah.
And he really loved the character and loved playing Barnabas. And he wanted to continue playing Barnabas. But the Barnabas in the movie, he felt the image was much more of a violent monster who has to be killed. And he too was surprised by how many people became vampires. He didn't realize that how many until he really saw the film. So he went to talk to Dan. Probably I think Dan called him into the office is probably what happened, and wanted to talk about the second movie. And Jonathan said, Dan, second movie, then there'll be a third movie, then a fourth movie, and I'll only be seen as the monster Barnabas, and I don't want to be typecast. I want to do other things, theater things like I've been doing while I've been on the show. And Dan was very upset. I mean, both men were very strong individuals, and they had opinions, and they clashed over the situation. And Jonathan was taken aback because basically Dan said, well, if you don't want to play Barnabas in the movie, you're not going to get to play him on TV anymore. In other words, Jonathan left the office and thought, oh my gosh, I've talked myself out of my TV job. I didn't mean to do that. But he said, if that's what it must be, and that's when agents got involved and there were letters. So I'm going to clarify. In one of Catherine's books, it references about Jonathan wanting to be off the show. Basically, Jonathan was in many ways a private person, and he didn't go about and tell the whole cast and everybody, look what happened to me. He basically called his agent. Very few people knew that he was going to be off the show.
He was fired. He was fired
basically,
at this
Dan
point.
said, you're going to be off the show. Very few people in the cast or crew, anybody knew that.
And there's paperwork that shows this. I mean, you've provided it. I'm going to show it in this episode. You showed some of it too in the documentary.
Right, in the documentary, I showed it.
And it flew over people's heads. I think it didn't kind of flew past their radar. Some people caught it, but not as many people as you would imagine. But please continue. Yeah.
I mean, it is basically the decision was made, you're off the show. But when Jonathan called his agent, the agent said, well, you're under contract and you still have another cycle on your contract. His cycle would have ended at the beginning of April. And so the choice for Dan could be, well, you could just pay him and not work him, but that seems rather silly. You would want the actor's going to get paid, he might as well work. So the letters basically are saying, well, you want him off the show, but you've got another cycle. And then if you want to write him off, that's fine. And Jonathan was accepted it. I mean, yes, he was disappointed, but he said, Dan wants to make the decision. He's the boss. I'll leave the show. So the letters were going back and forth in December. It's interesting, right before Christmas. And the writers probably, and producer Leela Swift probably were told that something was going to go on because they would have to write something else. And there's an interesting conversation that Alexandra Mulkey-Isles talks about in an interview, receiving a call from Leela Swift about possibly coming back. And I believe that was, they were coming up with how would we possibly get Barnabas off the show. And maybe they thought there was a way of bringing her back to do that. It's hard to say specifically. It was a general question about whether she would come back to the show as the character. So I think the writers were aware and trying to come up with ideas. And over the holidays, basically, Jonathan wasn't sure what his schedule was going to be. And in fact, if you watch, there's 9 shows in a row he's not in at the beginning of the year. Like when they're taping on December 31st of 1970, Jonathan's like not in the show for like 9 episodes in a row, which is extremely rare, unless he had a specific vacation. That's a big chunk of time for Barnabas not to be in an episode. So I think this was where Dan had talked to the writers and said, to try to figure something out. But then something else was happening, which is what you mentioned earlier. The network was very concerned, which is ABC, because they were losing a lot of money in advertising dollars, because it was stated, and it was under the Nixon administration, that no longer should there be ads for cigarettes. And there were a lot of cigarette commercials during afternoon daytime TV, but with the realization of the connection to cancer and health, I assume is what was behind this, that they needed to say no more, don't advertise. So ABC was really stuck in looking at their budget. And this is when they contacted Dan Curtis to discuss budget, because as you did mention, it was not a cheap show. They had a lot of more than your average daytime show. I mean, they did special effects. That was unheard of. And even, I think, beautiful period costumes, everything was a cost factor. And so there was a meeting between an ABC executive and Dan Curtis about what to do. And I believe that there was discussions about just how can you simplify the show. The network was also looking at canceling a show, and under discussion was canceling One Life to Live, which was a fairly new show at the time. There are only 2 people that were in that room are no longer here. And so it's hard to know exactly what was said, but my thought is that Dan, realizing he wanted to be directing movies.
Yes. Yeah.
He was 40s. He was ready to start that aspect of his career. Very, very eager to do that and focus on that.
He openly said that he wanted out of the show in interviews. He flat out said that. Yeah.
Yeah. And even when he was doing House of Dark Shadows, when he was being interviewed, when that was starting, he said, this is what I want to do. So yes, he was ready to go do movies. They probably could have handed the show over to, like, Leela Swift was the line producer. She could have probably taken over, but maybe just Dan felt like, I don't want to, it was his creation. Maybe he felt, I don't want someone else running it, or he would still feel he needed to be somewhat involved. And so he just basically said, let's just cancel Dark Shadows. Instead of, you got to cancel a show, then cancel Dark Shadows.
Yeah, instead of lowering the budget or
right.
canceling One Life to Live, it was, and you worked on One Life to Live.
I did. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was on. Yes, it was on for years. One Life to
Yeah,
Live went on.
so that was the choice there, it seems, in that meeting. And I wonder if it was James Duffy that I referenced earlier who was talking to Dan Curtis, because he claims to have been the one to have pulled the plug on the show. Just cutting in after the fact, I had a little back and forth with Mary after this episode was recorded, and she mentioned Brandon Stoddard, who was the ABC director of daytime television in 1970. And we felt it was more likely that Dan Curtis may have had the meeting with Brandon Stoddard instead of James Duffy. Since James Duffy was the president of the network itself, it's probably likely that he just signed off on the cancellation rather than meeting with Dan Curtis, but it is quite likely that someone who's the head of daytime television, as Brandon Stoddard was at that time, is most likely the one who would meet with an executive producer like Dan Curtis. And Mary mentioned that in an interview, Catherine Lee Scott once said that Brandon Stoddard hid from fans who were protesting Dark Shadows' cancellation outside ABC headquarters in New York City. And putting these pieces together, it's kind of easy to see what was going on here. There was the big to-do between Dan and Jonathan, Dan being really eager to go make movies, and now ABC's asking him to lower the cost of the show because they lost cigarette advertising, and they're like, we'd rather cancel this. Because let's think about this. Dark Shadows was, even though the ratings were lower, One Life to Live didn't have board games with Barnabas on them and the horror head pillows and Josette's music box and all these things, I mean, the comic books and all of this stuff. It was still, and of course, we have to also take into consideration during this time, kids were not the prime demographic. Nowadays, I mean, well, I don't know about now it's streaming, but the younger demographic now is much coveted by television. Back then, it wasn't as much of a big deal if kids, they knew kids were watching the show, but I don't know if that was their prime demographic. It was probably, housewives, and that's probably what they were more focused on.
Yes, I think the prime demographic was the housewives who were at home, but suddenly when they had the younger audience, that's when all the merchandising really was board game. All the kids,
all the teen magazines, Dark Shadows was very popular in those teen magazines. So just jumping back to a couple of the things that you said, Alexandra Moltke, she did talk about, getting that call to come back. There was there was a lot going on during that period in December when, the letter from Richard Green, the lawyer, that was dated December 16th. That was when they taped the episode, the same day when Professor Stokes comes down the stairs into 1840, and they're setting it up to make it look like Thayer David is going to take over the proceedings with Dr. Hoffman and team up with her to go investigate the goings-on with Gerard and Judah Zachary. Something was happening during this time period. And then you mentioned Jonathan kind of, disappearing from the show for a while in early January. Also, I want to bring up Bob Austin, who was the horror host Bob Macabre in Western Massachusetts. I sent you this interview a while back. I know he's no longer with us, but he was on the Panel Nerds podcast, and they interviewed him. And they interviewed him about his horror host show that he did, but he was an actor. He did a lot of other things. And he talked about going to, and this is why he thinks he got the horror host gig in the first place, why his agent got him that job. He went down to New York to audition for Dark Shadows. And I'm going to play a snippet from that interview because he says that he auditioned for the role of Barnabas's brother.
Hey everybody, welcome to Nine Panel Nerds. I'm your host, Dave Krause, and once again, the panel is not here, but we have a special guest with us today, and I used to work with this man at Channel 40 in Springfield, and his name was Bob Macabre.
Bob Macabre.
Oh.
Welcome to my home.
Ooh, scary kids.
Scaredy kids.
And also joining us, as you will probably already know, that is the voice of Nine Panel Nerds, the opening and closing, and that's my friend Jim.
Episode number 30.
Now you know who he is. So there you go. I brought Bob here today because I wanted to talk to him about his horror hosting days.
It was a surprise.
It was?
Yes. And I have a feeling, I hadn't thought about this, but I have a feeling it may have stemmed from the fact that prior to the horror show, The House of Horrors, which was in the mid-'80s, 84 and 85, I think, I through Channel 40, ended up having some photographs taken, appointments made, and went to New York City to audition for the horror soap opera Dark Shadows.
Really?
Yes, they were looking for a brother, another guy to play the star's brother. Barnabas was his name. Yes,
what was his name?
Barnabas
Collins, but it was Jonathan Frist, I think.
Jonathan Frid.
Frid.
Yes,
Frid.
yeah. They were looking for a brother, another character, and so I got into my best suit and pictures and appointments, and headed to New York and went to ABC Studios, and he wasn't there. The director. He wasn't there.
What a waste of time.
And he was on the West Coast. He was doing something out there. And would I like to come back? So I said, well, all right. I was staying with friends in the village and hung around and was making phone calls every day. Dan Curtis was the director, who went on to do War and Remembrance and, and that kind of thing, The Winds of War. And he was still on the West Coast, and I just gave up. It was hot. I was running out of money. I had to get back to work. I got back to work, and about a week later, the show was canceled.
Oh,
wow. So something was up. So that was the end of that. But it was an interesting experience, something I probably never would have done otherwise.
And he went down to audition. When he got there, Dan Curtis wasn't there, was out on the West Coast, and he had to reschedule to come back to do this audition. Unfortunately, in the interim, he found out the show had been canceled. They let him know that Dark Shadows was canceled, and he never did get to audition for this role of Barnabas's brother. Now, as we know, Barnabas didn't have a brother. He had an uncle, Jeremiah, in the show, and this late in the game, they're auditioning the role of Barnabas's brother. And you and I talked about this, and I talked about this with Stuart Manning as well. This seems to have been some kind of veiled recasting attempt, perhaps?
It's also interesting. I think that Keith Prentice, if you look, he has a similar look to Jonathan, younger. I wonder if he might have been called in to read, as you suggested, for a quote, Barnabas's brother. And then they said, oh, we're going to do this 1840 parallel time, and let's bring him in and he can be Morgan. So they might have been looking, and then coming up with other writers were trying to come up with other ideas, and maybe then, because obviously when the word came back through the letter about, well, you still have Jonathan under contract, that it must have been in their minds, okay, well, we're going to be writing him off. We'll have him, but we'll figure out how to get him off. So let's go with that. But then, so January, think about the date, January 14th, it's only a few weeks into the new year of 1971, that the actors are told the show is canceled. So now that means the story that they're writing is going to be the end. And Jonathan being written off the show wasn't going to matter. The whole show would be gone. When his contract was up April 2nd, the whole show would be gone. So basically the reality was Jonathan wasn't fired because everybody was going to be off the show. So in some ways, the whole incident just resolved itself.
Yeah. Yep.
And people never actually knew. Most of the people connected to the show had no idea that Jonathan had been fired. But then, because everybody was let go at the same time, nobody really knew that. For years, nobody knew this story.
Yeah.
And you could say, well, what does it really matter? But the question that we don't know is, when Dan was in that show with ABC, did he have a moment of realizing, well, I fired my star. The writers are trying to come up with an idea. Well, here's another way of dealing with that. If the show's over, nobody knows that he was going to be fired.
Could it have also been that Dan Curtis told ABC that he fired Jonathan, and they told him there's not going to be any Dark Shadows without Jonathan? Could that have been a possibility as well, or?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I
I'm curious about that. I want to also add, I talked to Stuart Manning about this as well, this recasting possibility, and he said this was also done on in the Australian soap Prisoner, also known as Prisoner Cell Block H, which was about a women's prison. The top dog lead prisoner for the early years was B. Smith, played by Val Lehman, by all accounts, including her own, a bit of a diva, and also the actors' union rep on the show, which placed her at loggerheads with the show's producers. She was massively popular with audiences, so removing B was not straightforward, even though the relationship with management had deteriorated beyond the point of return. So while Val was on annual leave, the producers introduced a potential replacement top dog character who they auditioned with old B scripts with the name crossed out. So it was to find something similar enough for the ensemble to sideline B and ease the character out. Not exactly the same thing, but there some echoes there if they were in fact recasting Barnabas, which is kind of crazy to think about considering what a pop culture icon the character became, to bring in that late in the game, to bring in somebody new to play the part, if that was indeed what was going on. So as things turned out, so Jonathan was fired by Dan, and we have letters that you kindly provided. Richard Green, Esquire, which is Barovic and Konicki, December 16th, 1970. These are the lawyers for Dan Curtis or for ABC. I'm not sure.
I believe Dan Curtis Productions.
Okay. And says apparently Jonathan Frid and Dan Curtis had a conversation about Jonathan's continuing in the series and doing the new Dark Shadows motion picture. Jonathan has indicated a disenchantment with the image that he has as the star of Dark Shadows, and albeit reluctantly, Curtis and Frid have agreed he will not do the motion picture, and that beginning with this new 13-week cycle commencing in January of 1971, Frid will be phased out of the series. So there's that, and then there's the response, which clearly has definitely has a different tone. This is December 24th, 1970, from Richard Green. This is Jonathan's attorney, I assume, or Jonathan's management. Yeah.
Right.
And it says, I have taken up with Jonathan Frid your letter of December 16th, 1970, concerning the termination of his services in Dark Shadows. And I can put this up on the screen here. It says, Mr. Frid is not in accord with everything in your letter. As I understand it, he did tell Dan Curtis that he did not want to do the movie because he did not feel it helped his image. Mr. Curtis responded that if Mr. Frid was dissatisfied with his image in the motion picture, it would be best if he were phased out of the television program. To this, Mr. Frid replied that Mr. Curtis had his services for the next year, but if Mr. Curtis felt this way, felt the way it should be done, that was fine with him. It's unfortunate because I think this could have been resolved if they compromised. As you said, they both had very strong personalities. I think there could have been a compromise there. Jonathan could have said, I will play Barnabas, but I want input in the script and how the character is portrayed. I would like to be involved in the creative process. If Dan had agreed to that, maybe they could have reached some resolution with the movie, and also this wouldn't have been an issue with the TV show too.
I think that when Dan called Jonathan in, I don't think Dan expected Jonathan to say, don't want to do it. I think Dan was just going to tell him this is the idea for the script, or maybe this is when we plan to do it. And probably he was taken aback when Jonathan said, no, I'm really worried about typecasting. I don't want to do another movie. And then, so Dan was upset and said, well, then you don't have a job on the show, TV show. And then that stunned Jonathan's like, okay, if that's what you're saying, you're the boss. I mean, it was certainly, I'm sure, a heated moment.
I'm sure, yeah.
And probably neither person ultimately wanted that to be the case. And again, maybe there was the moment later, Dan might have said to himself, well, as I'm in this room making a decision about cancel, then the ABC is going to either cut the budget or cancel the show. Maybe the fact is, well, I also don't have a story to, I don't have a star right now. That added a piece to him saying, just let the show go. And then nobody had to know. And Jonathan really wasn't fired because he still got to play out the next cycle with the rest of the cast.
Yeah.
It's hard to know. I mean, even in some interviews post Dark Shadows, when Dan would be asked about Jonathan. He usually came back with sort of a negative sense of, well, Jonathan thought a vampire was beneath him, which was not the case, but that was Dan's interpretation. I think it was a sore spot, and it was a long time, maybe perhaps, but before he let it go. But it was jumping way ahead. Mark Duisiak, who interviewed Dan Curtis several times over the years, and also contributed to the 2004 book about Dan Curtis's career. He told me, Mark, when I talked to him, that, and it was in the latter years of Dan's life, that Dan reflected back on Jonathan and not realizing how central he was in the show's success until all these years later, now that we had it on VHS and DVD, that he had been, his way of playing the role had made the show a success. And it's wonderful to hear that he did finally think that. And Mark made a very interesting observation. Again, these are two very strong men. And Dan, the way he put it, was quite beautiful. He said, Dan was thrust into the theater. Jonathan was of the theater. And Jonathan came in and took the job very seriously. He wanted to do the best job he could in making this character as real, given the nature of the story. He worked very, very hard. Dan was constantly, what's the next story? What's the next story? And don't worry about mistakes, and just keep going. And we're not going to stop tape. And of course, Jonathan was, if I could do it so much better, if we could do it again, if I had more time. And everything about him as an artist was trying to do the best he could under a very tough situation, doing a show a day. And because of his dyslexia, he struggled with memorizing the lines. But he really, really wanted to do the best he could. And it really was because it was him, as I just said, as an artist. Yeah. And Dan was Dan had dreams, and he was a brilliant creative man too, in his own way. But they were very different personalities, and they saw things
almost opposite personalities.
Yeah.
Very, very and Jonathan Frid, clearly he said people would say, he didn't want to play Barnabas anymore. He never said he didn't want to play Barnabas. As you said, he really enjoyed playing Barnabas. He said in one of the articles you sent me, Macbeth or Richard III, he could find just as much joy in playing Barnabas as he could in those characters, because he could find the complexity in the character and play. He used to like saying playing between two poles and playing the gray areas in that character, and sometimes tipping the scale one way or the other, and playing the loneliness of the character and all of this, which in House of Dark Shadows, you get little hints of that, but I can see why he would. And Jonathan was he certainly was not a fan of the subject matter, I guess, in terms of the horror genre, or he would often comment on, I don't want to be associated with, he didn't want to be typecast. Dan Curtis was a big enthusiast of that stuff. He was into that stuff. And I remember, like you said in the article, he said House of Dark Shadows was going to make Bela Lugosi's Dracula look like high school stuff or something.
But, one thing I wanted to mention that came up earlier, when Jonathan saw House of Dark Shadows with so much blood and gore, he was also concerned about the young people who were coming to the show, because he so enjoyed seeing the fans outside the studio, and he would give them autographs, and I enjoyed meeting them and pose for photographs. And he thought, wow, they're coming to see this film. And because many of them were at the age their parents were driving them to the movie, they might have been 12, 13. He also felt that the ratings went down after the movie came out, because the parents looked at the kids and said, "What are you watching? This is a bloody show. You can't watch it anymore." Mm-hmm. And he also felt that that was an influence with the ratings, that the realization for some people, like, this is pretty violent. And there were some articles I also saw, or like letters to the editors, is like, we were brought this children's group to see this movie, and the parents were horrified, like they didn't know. They hadn't seen the show, and yet, but that wasn't the show, as you know, Danielle. It was, like Jonathan said, it's just a fantasy of Brigadoon, and you rarely really saw violence. And certainly early on, it was, again, the fangs to go in, but then you don't see the blood. There were those select episodes, and I don't remember what episode it was, but Jonathan said that the show wasn't showing in Buffalo. And then they finally said, well, we keep hearing this as a hit show, let's show it. And right at that time was a very violent episode.
Yeah.
And the station said, like, they got so many letters from parents, what is this show you put on in the afternoon? My child shouldn't watch this. So I don't know whether it was, when he was all bloody, or the werewolf had torn somebody up, or what it was.
But it was rare. It was they were moments of that. I mean, you're dealing with werewolves and vampires, but it was never the emphasis. I always kind of look at the TV show as kind of universal and movies, and the movie was Hammer. So, as Boris Karloff would often say, I don't make horror movies, I make terror films. And the TV show leaned much more on the mystery and the escape and the terror, what's hiding around the corner or in the shadows, or the thunderstorm that's, get the lights go out, and it's much more an escape. Whereas the movie is a colder kind of place.
Yes, and I also think that, Jonathan grew up as a young boy going to the movies, and this was a spectacular thing. And he felt that more people were seeing the movie and seeing this impression of a monster, which had been several years creating this multifaceted character, our sympathetic vampire, and that they would get misrepresented. The show was misrepresented by the movie. But as you said, if you loved Hammer films, but even again in some of the reviews were that it was very, very bloody. They found, if they didn't know the TV show, they said they found it confusing, like they felt you were coming into the story halfway and they'd missed something. Also, the comments about how dark it was. So again, there are movies, as we all know, that didn't get critically panned, and then they're success financially, but this was.
No, just going back to, we see the bat at the end. There were plans to continue to bring Barnabas back. And I know Jonathan said in subsequent articles, like, he just foresaw this situation where he was going to be Barnabas forever in one movie after another. And I had heard it was his agent that was kind of encouraging him to step away from all of that. Or was it Jonathan himself who made that decision? Because in these interviews, I've never seen him reference his people encouraging him to step away from he didn't do all these horror films that were offered to him. Was that his choice, you think, or was it his management that was encouraging him to stay away from that?
Danielle, are you talking about after Dark Shadows or while he was on Dark Shadows?
Both while he was on and then after Dark Shadows ended.
He wanted to try other things, but he loved his job on Dark Shadows. He, as he said, it was the most consistent job he'd ever had in his career. It was the best paid he had in his career. So he was happy to do that, but he did love opportunities to go and do a show or speaking engagements at some universities, which he also did during his time.
I guess I mean in terms of typecasting.
Well, it's interesting because some people say, well, he was typecast from the TV show, and he just somehow thought the movie was where it was happening. And he thought that because he saw Barnabas as multifaceted, that he would be able to get other roles whenever the show ended, before this whole situation occurred. Really, I think to him, was by not doing the next movie, he had hoped that he would not be typecast. But the interesting thing was that he would find, when his agent would send him to auditions, that people, oh, you're the vampire. Right. They might not have seen Dark Shadows, but the media had pushed pictures of the fangs and vampire. Oh, we know vampires, Bela Lugosi. So can you do your thing, Mr. Frid? And he said, well, what do you mean? I'm an actor. What do you want in the scene? A commercial, whatever it was. And they said, well, vampire thing. And he said, I don't have a thing. So he realized, oh, they're just going by a image of me with fangs, having never watched the show, or maybe the movie. But he hadn't, because he felt the character was so varied that wouldn't happen. But it did happen. And it did. He was being, he got a new agent right towards the end of Dark Shadows to try to see what other things could happen. But he was getting a lot of offers to do horror, and he said, no, 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 I don't want to do that, which probably upset the agents because they wanted him to get roles. I mean, that's how the agents get their money. The actor gets a job and you get the commission.
Yeah.
But I mean, Jonathan made his own choices, his own decisions. He wasn't somebody who would be led by a manager to say, go
Okay.
do this. I don't, yeah, he wouldn't do something unless he wanted to.
I just wanted to clarify that, just because I have heard that before, and I just wanted to kind of clear the air on that. Speaking of clearing the air, I want to go back to something you touched on, but that we didn't fully explore here. For many decades, people have said, many fans have said, and this has just been the thing that people just repeat, oh, Jonathan Frid didn't want to play Barnabas anymore. He insisted on playing another character, and that's why they came up with Bramwell. That is not why they came up with Bramwell. It was Dan Curtis who told the writers to come up with Bramwell. And when I had Elena Nicanthor on here, she talked about that too. Of course, she was close with Jonathan as well. I have heard from, over the years, fans have always said, oh, Jonathan Frid insisted he wanted to play a different character because everybody else got to play some. But I heard, from more inside sources, I guess, that it was actually Dan Curtis's idea to have Bramwell as a character in the 1841 parallel time storyline and all of that, to create a new character for Jonathan. And I'm sure Jonathan enjoyed the opportunity to play a new character for sure. But as I understand it, it wasn't Jonathan's idea. It was Dan Curtis's idea for this to happen. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Mhm.
It all happened because Jonathan did not want to do a second movie.
Yeah.
And Dan said to him, if you don't want to play Barnabas in a second movie, obviously you don't want to play it on the show.
Mhm.
So he was phasing the character of Barnabas out. And Jonathan was supposed to end Barnabas in January sometime of 71.
Mhm.
And then we got the word that the show was going to end, and the Bramwell character was created. And he played Bramwell from January to, I guess, March it was, that they taped the last show. I think it was March 24th was the last show that was
Mhm.
taped.
Mhm.
And he played Bramwell. And
Wow.
what was strange about the whole thing is that once that Bramwell story started, the ratings shot up
Yeah.
immensely.
Yeah.
People loved Bramwell. And who could not love Bramwell? I mean, really. That had to be the most handsome character ever. That hair. Oh my God.
Bramwell was not Jonathan's. He didn't demand to play another character. He would have been fine continuing to play Barnabas for another year. He said, you have me for another year. I'm sure he was happy to get a chance to play a different character. Any actor would be like, after every day for 4 years playing the same character, oh, you get to play another character. I'm sure he was okay. That'll be fun. As an actor, I'm sure that was fun for him. But he was not the one who came up with that.
Right. Yes, exactly. I do get frustrated when I hear that comment. Oh, he didn't want to play Barnabas, so they created Bramwell. No, he would have been happy to play Barnabas for the rest of his time there. That the writers were told by Dan, because Dan had said to them, I've told Fred he's not going to play Barnabas anymore, even though now the show is going to be canceled. I think he just felt, let's not have him be Barnabas because I don't want him to be Barnabas. Create something else.
To write out the rest of his contract until April.
To write out the rest of his contract, the rest of the series, correct. And the writers, I mean, Jonathan often talked about back when he was first cast on Dark Shadows, he was called in on a Saturday with the writers to talk about the character and the sense of that duality of he's a monster, but no, underneath he has, we're going to feel for him and have sympathy. Jonathan said the same thing with Bramwell, as then they called him in and said, okay, let's talk about the character. And so it was like almost a replay of what had happened initially. And he was just very excited to play a new character, but he didn't create it. Now, some people might say that when he was at festivals, and Dark Shadows festivals, and he was asked questions, he occasionally might have said, oh, Yeah, I talked to him about Bramwell. He might have said something that led them to believe, oh, he asked them to
I
create
remember he
Bramwell.
did say, he said something like, well, everybody else was
Yeah, let me have
doing it.
another
Why
part.
don't I? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. But I would say partially because Jonathan never told this story. I think Jonathan felt, again, what happened was private and ultimately was moot because the show was canceled. So he ended when the same time all the rest of the cast ended. So he never brought this up. He never talked about it. The interesting thing is, and as in one of Catherine's books too, it talks about similar or something about, oh, he wanted to play something else. Well, because the fact is nobody really knew the story. It wasn't until back at the last couple of years of Jonathan's life, he was going to Dark Shadows festivals, 2008, 9, 10, 11, and he kept every piece of paper throughout his career, photographs, playbills, and I know this because I worked with him, and I went over all his playbills back in the day to get his equity pension because you had to list everything and send reviews, and he decided, well, maybe I'll bring to the Dark Shadows Festival all this Dark Shadows stuff because I'm getting towards the end of my life. What am I going to do with all this? And he brought down boxes, which included his contracts and information of these letters were in this material. So 2011, here it is. Jim Pearson, who wonderfully ran the Dark Shadows Festivals for many years with Marcy, Robin, Kathy, Bresh, Ann Wilson, said, well, wait a minute, let me look at some of this. And then he realized these were documents that would be wonderful to keep and preserve. So he took a percentage of them and put them aside. And the next year, like Jonathan passed away, sadly, he was going to come to that 2012 festival, but he passed away in April 2012. So Jim was going through the papers, and then he now discovered this piece of information that he hadn't known. And so in the Master of Dark Shadows, a documentary on Dan Curtis, which I was interviewed for, because Jonathan, as Jim put it, Jonathan's no longer with us. Can you be the voice of Jonathan? He potentially was going to discuss this, and I was sort of said, well, I'm not even really sure if I remember Jonathan talking about this. But then later, there was one time that I had a conversation with Jonathan in the late 80s when the VHS tapes started to come out after I was trying to figure out how to pay the actors, because it was a whole new thing. First of all, soap operas, I mean, didn't even have reruns, never mind now they're on VHS tapes, and they were trying to figure that out. And they said, okay, well, there's a percentage that's paid to them. But then these collages were created, the Curse of Collinwood, the Best of Barnabas, and that the unions, so Jonathan and I had on his behalf was working with the union to say, well, this is a new product. This isn't just reruns. And during this time, Jonathan said, well, Curtis probably doesn't want to pay us. And I had a lot of issues over merchandising with him. And he actually showed me a lot of these letters where he said, my agents kept saying, Jonathan should get a percentage of merchandising. And they kept asking, and Dan never addressed it, kept putting it off. So I didn't get merchandising money. And he said, and he even I think he even said something about it. And at one point he wanted me off the show, but I didn't pursue it at the time. It was just, he was just angry about what was perhaps that the actors weren't going to get any money. Fortunately they did, and he was quite pleased that they got compensated.
The merchandising issue was even referenced in that letter from 1970s. Mr. Frid, I refer particularly to the merchandising terms. Mr. Frid tells me that neither he nor his agent has received a statement on the merchandise, although there has apparently been a fair amount of this, and by now there should be some revenue, and in any case, some statements. So it was right there in writing.
And then yet you can find letters from 68, 69, where it's like, we're waiting to hear back. And because again, Jonathan kept all these letters, waiting to hear back. What about, like, and now there's books coming out, there's buttons coming out with his name on, his image on them, like we have. And this was all new ground. the shows didn't have this kind of
Yeah.
merchandise at that time. It's quite common now, we know, to have merchandise.
Oh, I had just side note. I mean, I had there was a little get together I was at with Pat Priest, who played Marilyn Munster in the Munsters,
Oh,
and
okay.
somebody gave her a Marilyn Munster doll, and she said, I never got a penny from any of this stuff. I never that back then there was just it wasn't a
Yeah.
thing.
And I mean, some people think, oh, Jonathan must have made a lot. No, he never made anything for merchandising. The only thing was the game. And really, because there was a commercial, which Terrain was in, and some children, and it had to be after, said, well, you have to pay for that. So he
Yeah.
got paid for that. But in terms of all the other things, Viewmaster reels, everything else, he didn't.
When you say, Jonathan didn't really talk about this, but early on, he did mention it a couple of times, and you sent
Yes.
me these articles. And
Yes.
again, nobody really seems to have picked up on these things. 1971 Daytime Magazine and Houston Post, July 21st, 1971. And I know I've seen that Daytime Magazine article before, and it didn't hit me because the way he phrased it, it was, I'm going to pull it up and just read a couple of quick excerpts from these, because he kind of just flat out says it right there. Okay, so this is the one from the Daytime Magazine article. It says, quite frankly, I knew the show was on its last legs before the cancellation was announced, maybe as far back as last November. I was almost out of the show on the first of the year, but I wanted to try another character. So he here says he wanted to try another character, but he's being classy about how he's saying this. We could have done something else. We could have revived Barnabas and then done that whole biting bit again, but I didn't want to. When Dan Curtis, the producer, and I discussed the movie, I told him I wouldn't play Barnabas in the second film. He said, well, I guess you want to get out of the show too. I hadn't been bargaining for that, but I said to myself, why not? Maybe it's time. As it worked out, though, I stayed. And then in this Houston Post article, it said, the last story on Dark Shadows for the last 4 months of the show was Wuthering Heights, and I was playing Heathcliff, although the character's name was Bramwell. What happened is that Frid, while still playing Barnabas, went in to talk to the show's producer, Dan Curtis, about the second movie spin-off from the serial. Frid did not want to appear in that film, although he had starred in the first. And Jonathan says, I felt as if I made the second one, I would make the third, the fourth, and the fifth, and I would always be playing Barnabas, Frid said. This he tried to explain to Curtis. Curtis took it to mean that Frid wanted out of the series as well. Suddenly, Frid said, I found that I had fired myself. I walked away from Dan's office saying, Johnny, what have you done?
Yes, I know it's interesting because those are right within the year after the show, 6 months to a year after the show had gone off. I mean, Jonathan really was. I mean, this has often been said. He was a gentleman. He was a very, very respectful person. But like anybody, you could get angry and have a temper. But I'm sure he felt I should, not maybe insult my producer, who gave me this wonderful job for many years. So he couched it in a way that it was, he was written off the show, and he was suddenly stunned because he loved the character on the show, but it was about the movie that he had the issues. And he didn't go in ever thinking that was going to happen. I think he really was totally taken aback.
And I wonder if that whole experience that happened there kind of soured him for a while on just Barnabas or Dark Shadows in general, because you can't walk away from something like that without some kind of even feeling, I know I would feel down about that. If something like that happened to me, I would, I know in one of the articles, he said, I never, ever want to play Barnabas again. After this was in one of these articles that I just read from, I imagine that must have stung a little during that time. I don't know. I'm just speculating there. But he also felt, I think, a sense of relief. He said it was time to move on. I probably should have left a couple of years ago. And I think that's another factor in the show's cancellation. When Dan Curtis was faced with the option of canceling Dark Shadows or letting ABC cancel One Life to Live, and presumably Dan may have opted, no, go ahead and cancel Dark Shadows. I think there was burnout involved. He wanted to go on and make movies. He always says, we ran out of ideas. I don't buy that. There are, thousands and thousands of Gothic horror and Gothic romance stories that they could have pulled from, and new material that they could have come up with. The writers, we were down to the last several months of the show was Gordon Russell, with Violet Wells ghostwriting some of Gordon Russell's scripts. Sam Hall was, I think he wrote the last one, but was mostly Gordon Russell doing a lot of the heavy lifting with Violet. And Sam Hall and Gordon Russell were, I mean, you needed more, a new infusion, I think, of writers. David Hennessy had presumably, I don't know if he would have come back. It looked like he left the show during the 1840 storyline. If they had come back to the present, if David Hennessy had left, they wouldn't have had David anymore. Louis Edmonds was thinking about leaving the show already at this point, too. I'm sure Joan Bennett was probably an expensive contract. Maybe, I think it was Stewart said, well, maybe they could have taken her off contract and she could have just come in and done it. I don't know. I don't know if that would have been a possibility, but I'm sure there were a lot of other factors, burnout being chief among them.
Yes, it is. I've worked on 5 daytime shows. It is such a challenge for the writer. You're coming up with a new script every day, 260 episodes a year. It is tremendous amount of work. And I'm sure there are times when the writers were like, oh, what are we going to do? And Dan barrels in and says, okay, we'll try this. So I was like, okay, well, wait a minute. We sent Adam upstairs. Don't worry about it. Let's just get into a werewolf storyline. And, they're like, okay, trying to figure it out. Absolutely burnout factor. It's exhausting. But then what you do, as you suggested, bring in some new writers, bring in some new characters. You can always have your core family, but maybe they suddenly go a little bit into that, what we call like the B or C story, like A is the prime story and then there's B and C. And they could not work as much. Like, as a matter of fact, John Carlin never wanted to be under contract. So he would have the freedom to come and go and do other things. And Dan was fine with that. Well, someone like Joan too, well, I don't want to be under contract. I want to come and go. Or, I mean, they could have worked things out. Sometimes it's hard. I mean, it's hard on the writers because they have to, balance. Okay, wait a minute, she only wants to come in, once a month, whatever it might be. But again, I've been on many shows with stipulations and contracts for working at a certain time of day, or having, Tony Geary had 6 weeks vacation off from General Hospital. There were things the writers were told, you got to work around this. And there definitely were options. And again, I'm thinking that you get another producer in there. But Sam Hall was pulled to write Night of Dark Shadows. He and Dan, I was basically told, Dan wasn't even at the studio the last few months. Once it was going to be canceled, he's like, okay, now I got to work on Night of Dark Shadows, as well as he had other projects going on. He was addressing a couple of other scripts with people and doing them as potentially, maybe there wouldn't have been a third Dark Shadows, maybe it would have a completely different film, because he had a lot of different ideas that he was talking to writers about. So his focus shifted as soon as it was like, he was gone. Let me work on my next project. And everybody at the studio was, I think, having kind of like, oh, this is the end. And all right, we just enjoy the last few months we have together. So, as we all know, I mean, that he went on to do the incredible Winds of War and War Remember.
Oh, yes, yeah, absolutely.
Series. And then also he did a lovely movie called When Every Day Was the 4th of July.
Yes.
And that was designed to be a pilot for a series, and it didn't get picked up. So he did other things beyond the horror, but we so strongly associated with that because so much of his work was. But what I was just going to mention when you were talking about they were auditioning potentially, quote, Barnabas's brother, but also at that time, David Selby was going on a lot more appearances. He was being pushed forward, go be in the parade of Thanksgiving. I was seeing some of that when I was doing research. So again, probably would have been, they did have David in terms of the storyline. And if they did have Barnabas go, well, we have Quentin and incorporating him even more into the story. Because he carried it, like when House of Dark Shadows was filming, we were focused on Quentin.
That was a thought that when I had the podcast summit with the other podcasters, that they said, why maybe Quentin could have, if Jonathan had left the show, maybe Quentin could have then taken over in that kind of role, maybe become the werewolf again and dealing with his curse or something like that. I could definitely have seen something like that happening as well. And that was another thing that was I think challenging. Talk about strain. When during the Leviathan storyline, Sam Hall and Gordon Russell were writing House of Dark Shadows, and they were all preparing to do House of Dark Shadows. Then during the parallel time 1970s storyline, the TV show is going on and they're filming House of Dark Shadows at the same time. And, they put Barnabas in the coffin, so Jonathan Frid wasn't there, but, you sometimes had, Grayson Hall coming back to do an episode, or Catherine, or, somebody else. I'm sure that, and you had all of this going on, at a lot of plates spinning at the same time. I'm sure that must have been quite a strain as well on
Right,
them.
because I think there was a story about one day they had Grayson at the film site, and they're calling from the studio saying, "You're in today's episode," and they said, "Well, we scheduled her here at the movie." So okay, somebody made a mistake somewhere, but right, that was obviously a stressful scheduling time getting
Yeah,
people
for
commute,
sure.
and the actors are living in Manhattan. They would pick them up in the car and bring them up to the film site. So
I mean, this is fascinating in many ways. That some of this information has been out there since 1971 to some degree, but in those two articles, but kind of obscure. You did put out there in the documentary, in the Dark Shadows and Beyond, the Jonathan Frid story, and yet many people have not it hasn't registered. So I'm hoping that this episode will at least shed light on a major component that I think factored into the cancellation of Dark Shadows. Like Wallace McBride said in his article, like Murder on the Orient Express, it wasn't just one thing, but I think this could have been maybe the straw that broke the camel's back here. This must have been quite a to-do during that time when this was going on. And the fact that the cast wasn't aware that this was going on, that it's remarkable that this was just kind of going on between Jonathan and Dan, and that
agents and lawyers.
and the lawyers, yeah, and the agents, yeah.
And no, again, I mean, and Leela Swift, obviously, as
Oh.
the prime producer, and the writers, I'm sure he barreled in and said, "Look, this is the situation,"
Sure.
and some ideas. Again, if he thought at first, "I'll just have him not even work the next 3 months," but that quickly was, "Oh no, you're paying him, you might as well have him work." How quickly would they have tried to disappear him? Like, I mean, I don't
Yeah.
know. I guess they were, as you said, they just came back. We only briefly saw Collinwood of present day. It was 1840 and then 1840 parallel time. So I don't know how.
In parallel time, I like to imagine that Jonathan Frid sat down with Dan Curtis and they shook hands and said, "You know what? Let's reach a compromise. I'll do it this way if you let me do it this way." And okay, let's do it. And Dark Shadows went on for another, I don't know, 2, 3, 5, 4, 5 years, but maybe it ended when it should have ended. And maybe that's part of why it has such devotion now, is that we want more Dark Shadows. We don't want it to end.
Isn't it amazing? All these years later, so many new fans are coming to it, and they'll go on the social media and start making like observations about the scripts, or questions about why this might have happened. And I'm thinking, well, we who are original fans, have long ago talked about that, and yet now everything to them is new and exciting, and yet we're like, this show's been around a long time.
Yeah,
It's very rare something that you could find new, but they're just drawn into the show and then become great fans of it. So that's exciting to
It was
see.
great to see quite a few young fans at the Remembrance weekend too.
Yes.
I was really happy to see that. People even dressed up on Saturday. I saw people dressed up. There was a little kid dressed up. I didn't see the little kid dressed as Barnabas, but somebody told me. And there were people, dressed in all kinds of 60s outfits and all that. I don't know. It was really just cool to see young people embracing Dark Shadows and being just as enthusiastic about it as those who ran home from school to watch it in the 60s.
Yeah, such a range, actually.
Yeah.
And some people who maybe were original fans but never knew about the Dark Shadows festivals and couldn't go at the time, and it's like they got a little flavor of it coming to the Remembrance weekend. It was really, really nice to see that.
Is there anything I didn't touch on that you wanted to touch on that we didn't cover?
No, I think we covered it. Again, I just think we had two strong-willed individuals that had this conflict that really was resolved in a few weeks, in terms of the show, because the show was canceled, and we all that have felt a closeness to the show, wish it could have continued. And could it have? Well, it didn't. And we can't go back and change that,
Yeah.
But we have to enjoy the episodes we have and keep passing on, keep continuing the legacy.
Yes, and which I'm excited to see. It will be happening in Tarrytown at the Sleepy Hollow International Film Festival with 3 ladies from Dark Shadows, Marie Wallace, Donna Wandry, and Sharon Smith. And of course, Mary O'Leary herself will be there at the Q&A and the David Selby readings of Jonathan's letters to his parents, which was so beautiful. I said it when I did that episode. There wasn't a dry eye in the house. Everybody was so moved by that. It was funny. It was so moving, bittersweet, and wonderful. And David Selby was magnificent. He just was wonderful delivering those letters. It was great, really great. So I'm glad you're going to be showing that at Sleepy Hollow.
Yes. Thank you, David, for the performance and for letting us show it.
And thank you, Mary, for joining me once again. And thank you for sitting down and talking about this. We've talked about this privately for quite a while, and I've been wanting to do this episode for a while now, just to kind of set the record straight. And it's probably not the most, cheerful topic to talk about, but I think it's been almost 60 years now, well, since the show debuted. And I think it's important to have factual information out there, and we're not pointing the finger at any one person here. It's just, this is what happened. And I think it's good to set the record straight about that.
Thank you, Janelle.
Thank you, Mary. Take care. And thank you, folks, for listening. Please, if you like this episode, please make sure to rate the podcast. If you listen on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, really important. If you're listening to the audio version of the podcast and you want to see some of the materials that Mary so kindly provided, that kind of shed light on this stuff officially, the letters and articles, jump on over to YouTube and check out the YouTube version of this. I will be putting up a few images here to illustrate the points that we're talking about here. I'm adding a little epilogue to this episode because Mary and I unpacked a lot here. We covered a lot of different points and really dove deep into all of this stuff that has barely been talked about before. So I put together a quick little bullet point just to hit all the main things that we discussed. We talked about the ratings misconception. The ratings in the last year of Dark Shadows were not the best, but they weren't the worst either. They were somewhere in the middle. There were still 12 million homes tuning into Dark Shadows. Yes, several affiliates dropped the show, but it was still a popular enough attraction that cancellation was not justified. On top of that, Dark Shadows had been a huge pop culture phenomenon. It was still in the air. House of Dark Shadows. There was a lot of fallout from House of Dark Shadows. If we're going to point the finger at one thing, it's probably inadvertently House of Dark Shadows. Much as I love House of Dark Shadows too, it set off a major chain reaction. Not only did it put a huge strain on the show itself, because the writers had to do double duty, the actors had to do double duty, the producer had to do double duty. There was a lot going on when they were writing House of Dark Shadows, when they were making House of Dark Shadows while doing the TV show at the same time. That strain played a role. And also, Jonathan Frid really disliked House of Dark Shadows. He disliked the gore in House of Dark Shadows. He disliked the depiction of Barnabas in the film. He did not want to appear in the sequel. This set off a chain of events. When Dan Curtis talked to Jonathan Frid about the sequel, which they were starting to prep for, Jonathan Frid told him he did not want to do the sequel. In this meeting, Dan Curtis told Jonathan Frid, if you don't want to play Barnabas in the movie, I guess you don't want to play him in the show either, and he subsequently fired Jonathan Frid. However, Jonathan was still under contract. Curtis didn't want him to play Barnabas anymore, so he told the writers to create Bramwell, and they did this whole 1841 parallel time storyline. Jonathan Frid never asked to play Bramwell. This is a misconception as well that has lingered in the fandom for a long time. It was not Jonathan Frid's idea to play Bramwell. He never said, I don't want to play Barnabas anymore. Bramwell was created at the behest of Dan Curtis, who went to the writers and asked them to create the character for Jonathan Frid so that he would not play Barnabas anymore. Now, at around this time, they were apparently having actors come in to read for the part of Barnabas's brother. Now, Barnabas never had a brother in the show. We know that this was going on because Bob Austin, who was the horror host Bob McCobb in Western Massachusetts, did an interview where he, in fact, said he went to New York to audition for the part of Barnabas's brother. And he found out very shortly thereafter that Dark Shadows had been canceled. He tried to go down and audition. He never actually got to audition for the part. Now, a thought occurred to me when Mary brought up Keith Prentice potentially also auditioning for this same part and getting cast as Morgan Collins instead, when they decided to go full force with 1841 Parallel Time. Thought occurred to me, what if Bob Austin was misremembering and he was actually going down to audition for Jonathan Frid's character's cousin, which would then be Morgan Collins in 1841 Parallel Time. Maybe that's what he was auditioning for, and he confused Bramwell with Barnabas, brother with cousin. Although I would think if you're going down for a major thing like Dark Shadows on a major television network, you would remember what you were about to go audition for, and you wouldn't forget that you never really got the chance to do it. I think he's right. It was probably for a character listed as Barnabas's brother, and it was probably a recast situation where they were trying to recast Barnabas. That's my thought on that, and I spoke to a couple other people like Mary and Stuart Manning, and we were kind of thinking that might be the case. Although that's just an educated guess. Based on Bob Austin's interview, there's nothing in writing that says they were trying to recast Barnabas. Continuing on, loss of cigarette advertising on television reduced revenue for these shows. There were cigarette ads, that was a major source of revenue, and they lost that. So subsequently, this was another big nail in the coffin here too. ABC then asked Dan Curtis if he could bring down the cost of producing Dark Shadows, and Dan Curtis did not want to do that. You have to remember, Dark Shadows, as much as people joke that Dark Shadows, a shoestring budget, but by daytime television standards at that time, Dark Shadows was a very expensive show to produce because of special effects, period costumes, what have you. So it was not a cheap show to produce by daytime TV standards. And with special effects like ghosts and bats and dream sequences and all this other stuff, makeup effects, werewolves, warlock heads in a box, you gotta remember that, this was expensive. So ABC wanted to reduce the cost of producing the show. Why? To keep it on the air. That was a solution to keeping it on the air due to the loss of cigarette advertising. Supposedly, Dan Curtis did not want to do that. ABC instead wanted to cancel One Life to Live instead of Dark Shadows. If there was a show that was going to be on the chopping block, it sounds like they would have preferred not to cancel Dark Shadows and to cancel One Life to Live instead, and we're trying to find solutions to reduce the costs of producing Dark Shadows. Now, I hadn't known about the option to cancel One Life to Live over Dark Shadows until Mary told me. And you have to remember, Mary was a producer on One Life to Live. From 1997 to 2000, she worked on the show. Of course, that was quite a few years after Dark Shadows had ended, but, she was in that world. I'm sure she's heard a lot of things behind the scenes that we were not privy to. So Dan Curtis has this meeting with an ABC executive. It may have been James Duffy, the head of ABC at the time. I'm not sure if it was him, but James Duffy takes credit for canceling Dark Shadows in this article. Regardless, whether it was him or another ABC executive, after this meeting, which we're not privy to what happened in that meeting, but Dark Shadows was canceled after that meeting. I don't know if it was because Dan Curtis just said, nah, go ahead and cancel it. I don't know if it was because he told them that Jonathan Frid had been fired and they were like, well, we're not going to have Dark Shadows without Jonathan Frid. Sadly, we'll never know exactly what was said in that meeting, but we can kind of put these pieces together of this puzzle and kind of see a larger picture with several pieces missing still, but it becomes a lot clearer when we hear all these bits and pieces. Yes, the ratings were lower, they had lost some affiliates, but they weren't terrible. So I don't think it was the ratings. I'm sure that didn't help matters that they were down, but I don't think that was really a big factor in things. It was just something they could hang their hats on. In addition to this, so Dark Shadows is canceled. The actors find out in mid-January. The show stays on the air for 3 more months with this new character that they created for Jonathan Frid, Bramwell, and 1841 Parallel Time, which is completely disconnected from the main storyline. Really weird, that last storyline, and I'm sure there's more to all of this that we'll probably never know unless more documents surface. But there were a couple other factors I want to touch on. Dan Curtis wanted out of the show. He said so in interviews. He wanted to go make movies. He wanted out. As we know, Dan Curtis was the de facto head writer of Dark Shadows. As far as he was concerned, it was his baby. No way he's going to hand the reins over to anybody. And he wanted to go make movies. He had his sights set on going to make movies. There was also a burnout factor. I mean, doing this show for 5 years, can you imagine what an intense amount of pressure that must have been on everybody involved. And by the end, you had Gordon Russell writing almost all of the scripts along with Violet Wells, who was ghostwriting for Gordon. Violet wasn't even getting credited at the end there, but she was ghostwriting. I don't know exactly how many she wrote specifically. There was an interview with her where she talks about writing some of those episodes. Sam Hall wrote a few of the 1841 Parallel Time episodes, including the final one, but there's long stretches where he's not there. He's focused on Night of Dark Shadows because he wrote the screenplay for that. And also Dan Curtis is focused on Night of Dark Shadows. He was barely around in the last few months of the show. So when Dan Curtis or Sam Hall say, we ran out of ideas, we used all the stories, that's nonsense. I think that is code for we were exhausted, we were wiped out, man, we were tired, and we wanted to get out of there and move on to something else. Because the we ran out of ideas thing is BS. Let's be honest. I mean, there are thousands and thousands of gothic horror stories that they could have used. There are thousands and thousands of gothic romance stories they could have used. Film noir, folk horror, whatever you want, psychological horror. They could have worked all kinds of stuff into the mix, plus their own ideas. There were tons of things they could have done. Yeah, they used all the big A-list stories that everybody knows. They did Dracula, Frankenstein, Turn of the Screw, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, etc. Sure, they did the biggies, but there were still a lot of really good stories, novels, short stories, movies. They pulled a lot from cinema too, in that Rolodex of horror that they could have used, plus their own brilliant ideas. Absolutely. So we ran out of ideas. That means we were burned out and we were done. But if we're going to point out the three main culprits that led to the demise of Dark Shadows, based on this conversation I had with Mary, based on the evidence that she has uncovered, based on all of the available evidence that we have, I'm going to say it was the cost of producing the show, especially due to cigarette advertising pulling out, which was a huge blow. I'm going to say it was, of course, the disagreement that took place between Jonathan Frid and Dan Curtis over the sequel to House of Dark Shadows, the fallout from House of Dark Shadows, and Dan Curtis firing Jonathan Frid, something that has barely even been known up until very recently when Mary revealed that in the documentary. And even then, a lot of people didn't catch that. It was even referenced in 1971 articles. That is an incredibly important thing that happened behind the scenes in Dark Shadows that I think is the key reason Dark Shadows ended. Barnabas got fired from Dark Shadows. That's insane. I mean, it really is. But it happened. Okay, so there's that. And Dan Curtis wanting up and out. He wanted to get out and go make movies. He was bitten by the movie bug. He wanted to go make motion pictures. He had been doing Dark Shadows for 5 years. It's time to go. Plus, the burnout factor. I'm sure everybody was burned out from doing that show constantly. I mean, it must have been a wicked burnout situation. Can you imagine? Oh my God. I can't even imagine what that must have been like. Perhaps more information will come to light after this. I hope there is more information. I would love to know more about what happened behind the scenes, and maybe more documents will surface. You never know. There are people always online posting these rare documents, internal documents from Dan Curtis Productions. You never know what's going to turn up. So we might find out more things, and if that happens, that would be incredible. I hope that does happen. Just for the purposes of archiving history, I'm not into sensationalizing all of this. This is not why I'm doing this episode. The reason I wanted to do this episode was to set the record straight and dispel misconceptions that have built up over the decades in the fan community based on speculation. Thanks to Mary, thanks to research that Mary's done, that I've done, the information is there if you put the pieces together. And maybe more information will come to shed more light on this subject, but I hope this dispelled some misconceptions. And with that said, I thank you so much for listening, and please be sure to tune in to the next episode of Terror at Collinwood. And for as long as they lived, the dark shadows never truly vanished, for there will always be Terror at Collinwood. Terror at Collinwood is a Penny Dreadful production.